Okay, so we completed with the autotropic nutrition. Today we will start with heterotropic nutrition. Now, if we talk about heterotropic nutrition, there are various varieties. Like you all have learned in previous classes, there are like herbivores, there are carnivores, there are omnivores. And what are omnivores? Omnivores are those animals which feed on grass or maybe plants and animals, both of them. Carnivores are those animals, those who feed on the meat of other animals, but directly or indirectly everyone feed upon the heterotrophs. So after omnivores there are various categories in heterotropic nutrition, such as detrivores. Detrivores you all might have known, like the fungus, the algae and various other things. Okay, so now what we are going to learn here is a basic detail of heterotropic nutrition, and in that we are going to learn the human nutrition system. So the very first thing when it comes to the mind, the person or the thing which is, the animal which is herbivore, what will it eat? It will eat grass. Okay, so grass or maybe plants. So what I call it as, it is a stable type of food. But if I talk about carnivores and omnivores, and when younger animals or maybe animals of lower classes or herbivores which are eaten by these carnivores, what do they eat? They eat meat. So basically, if I see a buffalo and if I see a cheetah, the buffalo will get its food on its place. It won't need to search for its food. Whereas cheetah, on the other hand, has to search for its food. That may be anything, but again, the nutrition process remains the same. Now I will just talk about a basic nutrition. Now when I say basic, I mean amoeba. If I say amoeba, amoeba is a single cellular organism, as we all know, with a nucleus, of course. And in amoeba, you all have learned two concepts. One is pseudopodias, the leg-like structure which moves in an uneven pattern are known as pseudopodias. And the second one is phagocytosis. Now what is phagocytosis? It is very simple. Whenever a food particle for amoeba comes in its contact, what it usually does is take the food particle in between the pseudopodias and then it just engulfs the food particle. Now if I show this diagram, the pseudopodia will cover in such a way that the food particle gets engulfed. Okay, so inside there will be various enzymes, various reaction going on, wherein the food particle is inside the body of an amoeba, nucleus of course, in the food particle, and this food particle will get digested, and it is with the help of a vacuole. You all know what is vacuole. Anything which stores is known as vacuole. So this amoeba will digest the food, take all the nutrients, and similar to human, whatever waste it has, it will excrete out. Okay, so again this amoeba takes up all the nutrients. Of course, this is the nucleus, and the waste is excreted out. This is a simpler process of nutrition in amoeba, that is a single cell organism. Now we will learn something of complex cell organisms, or maybe us. We will just learn how the human nutrition takes place. Give a minute to rub the board. Okay, so if I talk about human nutrition, we are very complex. Now how does it mean? We have one thing, that is the passage. Which passage? Anyone? Okay, so that is the passage which is often starting from the oral cavity, that is the mouth, which I'm just targeting on the nutrition system. Fine. So the oral cavity, it starts from the oral cavity, it comes up to the mouth. From the mouth there is a thin tubular structure known as esophagus. Now this esophagus then bulges out into a structure which is at the left of your body. This is often known as stomach. Now this stomach will turn into a called tubular structure. Of course, you will get a better view of the diagram in the textbook than what I am drawing here. Okay, called tubular structure, which opens into a large tubular structure. So this is the small intestine and large intestine respectively. Now if I talk about the whole thing, okay, and the opening of the large intestine is known as the anus. The whole thing together constitutes a alimentary canal starting from the mouth up to the stomach, in the small intestine and in the large intestine. Now we will come on to the roles of each and every part, okay. So the first thing, whenever you take in food, even before taking in food, whenever you smell food, whenever you think of food, what happens is your mouth starts to water. Now what is that? Basically, in our terms, it's mouth watering, but in scientific term, it is the saliva coming out of your mouth by the salivary glands located in your mouth. Now this saliva contains enzymes, okay. The main enzyme of saliva is the salivary amylase. Now why am I telling this? Remember the last time I told you, starch is the source of food in plants. But in animals, the source of food is glycogen. So whenever there is starch in the food, the very first thing what happens is the salivary amylase help to digest the starch, because the starch cannot be stored in our system. So first thing, the saliva comes, the salivary amylase. The second thing is we pick up a proportionate amount of food via our hands into our mouth. Now what happens next? When the food goes into the mouth, we have teeth, okay. We are thecodont, right? 32 teeth and each in pair. So of course we have teeth which do the muscular or maybe the physical grinding and breakdown of food. Now I'll tell you what is physical breakdown and what is chemical breakdown. First thing, physical breakdown is something which you can see, that is breaking a ice is a physical breakdown. You break the ice into a smaller version of ice known as the ice cubes. The gola wala does the same thing. So that is the physical breakdown. But whenever you add a lemon or a vinegar to the milk, it turns into, of course, paneer and the whey protein, but that is a chemical breakdown. So the first thing what happens is the physical breakdown in our mouth via, yes, you are right, via the teeth. The mastication is the process wherein the teeth chew the food and make a small bolus-like substance which is easy for us to pass through the alimentary canal. Now the next thing what happens is the chemical breakdown. The very first chemical breakdown that happens in your body is via the salivary amylase that breaks down starch. So breaking of a molecule into a simpler molecule, let me get a hold of you. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose. Fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Then proteins are broken down into amino acids. Okay, so the very first part of digestion happens in your mouth. Whenever the question is asked, where is the first part of digestion, like where does the first part of digestion occur? It occurs in your mouth, because in mouth the physical digestion or physical chewing takes place. Along with that, the salivary amylase break down the complex carbohydrate into the simple carbohydrate, that is glucose. Now the remaining is fats and proteins. As we go further, we will understand. Now after the food has been chewed properly, formed into a small bolus like thing, it is passed via the esophagus. Now this esophagus is provided with a peristaltic movement. Now what is that? When a movement with subsequent opening and closing takes place, it is easier for the solid substance to be pushed downwards. So this movement occurs in the esophagus. After that, this food remains or maybe comes to your stomach. Now when the food comes to your stomach, the main thing about the stomach is it is acidic in nature. Now if I talk of something which is acidic in nature, you have to have a simple basic understanding on what is acid and what is base. The digestion in stomach is acidic in nature, while the digestion in the intestine is basic in nature. Now, since I said the stomach has acidic medium, so the very first thing that happens to your mind is the acid that is present in the stomach, and that acid is known as the hydrochloric acid or HCl. Along with hydrochloric acid, there are various other substances. Let us take a look of that. Another substance is pepsin. Okay, and one more substance is the mucous membrane. Now I'll tell you all in detail what are the function of these three. The very first thing, hydrochloric acid. What it does is similar to what the hydrochloric acid, inorganic hydrochloric acid, does in your chemistry lab. It usually kills all the bacteria, all the unwanted things that is present in your food. So it's fine if sometime you eat something without washing and then you get nothing. Like you say, I did not even wash my hands and still I'm fine. Why is it? Because of hydrochloric acid. Because it kills all the kinds of bacteria, the unwanted bacteria and everything. And again, it provides a acidic medium for the digestion of food. Now, in stomach, the main digestion of proteins takes place. Why? Because pepsin. Okay. Now, before coming into pepsin, I have already discussed about the salivary amylase which is present in your mouth. Now, before coming to pepsin, I would like to know that these things, the salivary amylase and all the names which I am going to take here are enzymes. The first enzyme is salivary amylase. The second enzyme is pepsin. The third enzyme will be trypsin. The fourth enzyme will be lipase. Okay, and there are various few other enzymes like the maltase and the lactase and the fructase. I'll write them down. Now, what are these enzymes? Enzymes, as you all have learned in lower standards, they are biocatalyst. Okay, enzymes are what? Nothing but biocatalyst. Now, if I talk about biocatalysts, the word itself tells that they are catalysts in terms of biology. Fine. So, what is a catalyst? If I talk about what is a catalyst is something which does not take part in the reaction but rather speeds up the chemical reaction. 2 points to remember: it does not take part. The other point, speeds up. Now, if I talk about catalyst in general term, okay, so if I keep a milk, okay, and if I just wait for it to set into curd, it is very difficult. So what we or maybe our mothers do in the kitchen is they take some milk and they add some of the original curd to it so that the new milk is set into curd. So the curd there acts as a catalyst because the curd is not losing its identity just because it is remaining curd. Okay, so it does not actually take part, but it speeds up the reaction of milk formation into curd. So these are catalysts, and biocatalysts are generally enzymes, or enzymes are generally biocatalysts. Now what do? They are present all over our body and they help in the digestion of certain proteins, certain carbohydrates, certain fats. These are the three main components which are digested in our body. So if I talk about the first two, or maybe the second two, it ends with syn. So remember this thing, this stands for protein. Okay. If I talk about lipase, lipo means lipids and lipids means fats. So the lipase stands for fat. And if I talk about the maltase, the lactose, and the fructose and salivary amylase, these are for breaking down of sugars. Now this kind of enzymes are present. So where were we? We were on the stomach. There is HCl. Why? We told you. Pepsin, you understood why. So that the proteins are broken down in the acidic medium. There are two types of proteins, acidic protein and basic protein. The acidic proteins are those proteins which are broken down in the acidic medium and therefore you need pepsin. Okay, then there are basic proteins which are broken down in the basic medium and therefore you need trypsin, that we will come on to later. Okay, so the third thing is the mucous membrane. Why mucous membrane? If you all have seen HCl, that is the hydrochloric acid, that is such a concentrated that its pH level is 2 to 3, and in that it is possible that the lining of the stomach gets degenerated. Of course, everything inside your body is made up of muscles, so the stomach is also a muscular organ which contracts and relax and just digests the food, but then higher amount of HCl has a possibility of degrading the stomach membrane. So to prevent that, what happens is there is a presence of mucous membrane. Now what is this mucous membrane? It is similar to the mucous membrane present in your nose. Okay, so the mucous membrane is present in order to not to harm the stomach from the hydrochloric acid activity. So this is why the mucous membrane is present. Now we will come on to let me tell you one thing. Every organ is guided by sphincters and not spinsters. Okay, sphincters. This is guided by that. This is guided by that. Every organ is guided by sphincters. Now what are the sphincters? It is similar to that of valves. Now what are valves and sphincters? Those are opening. Those are like a gate, a two-doored gate. Okay, they might be two-doored, they might be three-doored. Those are gates. Okay, when the food comes, they open, and when the food is not coming, they close. Similarly, you have glottis and epiglottis, wherein when the food comes, the epiglottis covers the trachea so that your food does not go into the windpipe and goes into the esophagus. So similarly, it is guided by sphincters. And one thing I would like to emphasize on this is regarding acidity. You all might have seen in adults, or maybe some of you might have experienced the slightest example wherein there is a cause of acidity. There is a immediate chest burn, there is, everything seems to be uneasy. So what is that exactly? When the amount of hydrochloric acid in your stomach starts to rise up. When does it start? Whenever your scheduled routine for eating has been skipped, it starts. And whenever it starts to rise up, what happens is the acid level increases, and they try to go through this valve to the sphincter and go upwards into the esophagus. And now esophagus does not have this kind of surrounding, so therefore you try, you get a chest burn or maybe pain, and everything is burning sensation which is cooled down whenever you eat something cool, that is somewhat basic or neutral. So this is regarding acidity. Whatever the ad shows, the ENO 6 seconds mein kaam chal jayega, similar to that. Okay, fine. After moving on to the stomach, we will come on to the small intestine. Now the twist here is, as I told you, the stomach needs acidic medium, while the small intestine needs basic medium. So how to convert acid into base? It's simple. The amount of acid you have, you neutralize and then convert into base by adding more base. Okay, fine. So what you are expected is, there are some kind of proteins, there are some kind of solutions which convert this acidic food into base. Now there are two more vital organs in the body which does this function. One is the liver, rough diagram please, and the other one is the pancreas. Okay, now what happens is, the liver has, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, the liver has bile and bile salts. Now what does they do? Okay, the bile salts help in, see, your in salivary amylase sugar was digested, your proteins were digested. So if carbs and sugars were digested, proteins were digested, what is remaining is fats. So what happens is, this liver produces bile salts. Now again, these are not enzymes, these are salts. Okay, remember the difference. They act as an enzyme, but they are not an enzyme. So this liver produces bile salts, and these bile salts, whenever they come in contact with the muscle of the stomach, these bile salts digest some amount of fats with the help of emulsification process. Now what is emulsification? You have learned this in chemistry. It is basically converting bigger fat molecules into a smaller fat molecules. So this releases bile salts which helps in emulsification. Now what is salt? Salt is a neutralized solution of acid and base. So therefore the acidic medium needs to be converted into basic medium. So what we use is the salt. Okay, and if we use the salt, what happens is, the acidic medium which is present in the stomach is neutralized and turned into basic medium. Okay, so this is the function of the liver. Now what you need to know is the function of the pancreas. Now what does pancreas do? As you all know, it produces glucagon and it produces insulin which helps in reducing sugar, and glucagon helps in uprising sugar. Fine. So this insulin is released by the pancreas along with certain digestive enzymes. All these things Partially they are released by pancreas and partially they are produced in the small intestine. Now if I talk about this, the food gets neutralized and then basic, and this basic food enters into the small intestine, wherein what happens is first the breakdown of carbohydrates, fats and proteins. After the breakdown, there is the absorption process. Now what is the absorption process? If I talk about small intestine, inside, assuming this is a pipe or a part of a small intestine, inside the small intestine there are various finger-like projection known as the villi. Okay, so this villi, why are they there? Basically they are connected with a huge and maybe a good supply of blood network or blood capillaries. But why are these villi present? You all might have learned in physics something known as the surface area. Now what I see throughout my skin is the surface area of my skin. Fine. So similarly, if you fold, okay, if you fold a rubber band, supposingly the rubber band is this length, and if you fold it, it will become narrow. But the surface area of the rubber band remains the same. Similarly, for increasing, now what are the function of the villi? It usually helps in absorption of this food particles. Okay, so this are like the food particles are absorbed, the glucose is absorbed, the amino acids are absorbed, the glycerol is absorbed, the fatty acids are absorbed, and this increases the surface area so that the absorption is increased. Okay, and after small intestine, when everything is absorbed, the food reaches the large intestine. Now if I talk about large intestine, it's a very fascinating thing. The large intestine is divided into 3 parts. Okay, you all don't have that in your textbook, that's fine. But then the large intestine has a vestigial organ known as the appendix, and what it does is the physical absorption of the food. Here what happen is the chemical absorption, that is all these things are absorbed. Here what happens is the physical absorption, that is the water which is there in the food is being absorbed, and after the water is being absorbed, all the minerals are being absorbed. What happens is the food or the unwanted food is let out through the anus. Now again, this anal opening is again guarded by sphincter walls. These are known as the anal sphincters. So this altogether sums up the human nutrition. Allow me to rub the board. We will start on with the respiration. So if I talk about respiration, or before I talk about respiration, there are a few activities which I would like you all to understand. The first thing is activity 6.3, wherein what they have told is take 1 ml of starch. You get the starch solution which is kind of whitish to maybe translucent in nature, not proper white nor proper transparent. So this starch solution you take 1 ml in 2 test tubes. Okay, and in 1 test tube what you do is you put your saliva. Fine. And after putting the saliva, let both the test tubes sit at the room temperature for about 20 to 30 minutes. After that, what you are going to do is you are going to add few drops of iodine. I told you in the previous lecture as well. Why is the iodine used? Iodine is the indicator of starch. So your starch is 1 ml. Okay, so or your starch is in proportionate amount. the one in which you have dropped saliva, you understand that half the starch has been broken down, and since it is broken down, it shows less color of iodine, or maybe less blue color. When iodine reacts with the starch, it turns dark blue. Okay, it becomes less of a blue color and more, and the test tube which does not have iodine, of course, become more of a blue color. So this is experiment 6.3. Then there is one more topic which I need to discuss, is the dental caries. Now what happens is, there are various kinds of bacteria present in your mouth. If you look at your hand, you will think like, my hand is very dirty, I need to sanitize it, I need to wash it. But when you realize you have more bacteria in your mouth than in your hand. So fine. So the very first thing, like from childhood, since childhood we have been told like we need to brush our teeth. Of course, some does it twice a day. Some people who are like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder kind of people, they do it after every now and then. Some people brush once a day, but it is advised to brush. Why? Because there are certain kind of bacteria which dissolve sugar, and of course it is told that don't eat sugary products, don't eat chocolates and all, it will damages your teeth and everything. So what happens is, there are few bacteria which act upon sugars, okay, and since you eat a large amount of sugar or maybe chocolates, the bacteria are produced in your mouth in larger quantities, and then this bacteria tends to sit on your teeth enamel. Now what is teeth enamel? The outer part of all the teeth, what you see is the teeth enamel. Now this bacteria settles on your teeth enamel, and then when you wash or when you brush, it gets removed. But if you don't wash, you don't brush, it stays as it is. And after it stays as it is, there is one formation known as the plaque. Okay, now this plaque, what is it? It is a formation of layer of bacteria which is generally seen as yellowish color on your teeth. This is when you don't brush your teeth properly, and this plaque kind of eradicates and erode your teeth, and therefore what happens is the cavity. For this, a dental care has to be taken, which is mentioned in your book, of course. So now we will start on with the respiration. So if I talk about respiration, there are certain activities which are there which has to be discussed. Okay, so the one thing, we have done quite of a respiration experiments during photosynthesis, like how is the carbon dioxide used and how is it formed, and what is the effect of light on the plants and leaves and the starch content and everything. Now we will come on to another experiment wherein what you have to take is a lime water. Now in chemistry you have learned that very well. Carbon dioxide turns lime water milky. So what you are going to take is 2 test tubes of lime water. In one test tube you keep the lime water as it is, while in the second test tube what you do is you take a straw and you blow your air out. Like when you breathe in the air which contains oxygen. When you breathe out the air which contains carbon dioxide instead of oxygen. So what you do is you just breathe out your air into the lime water, and what you observe is that lime water might and may be turning milky after a certain amount of time, but when you expel more amount of carbon dioxide from the first test tube, that lime water turns more milky. So this kinds of confirm that you breathe in air with, of course, everything including oxygen, but then you breathe out air with more of a carbon dioxide. So this process of breathing in oxygen and breathing out carbon dioxide is known as respiration. Now why we need to learn respiration? So as we finished with nutrition, what we have learned in nutrition is that when the food is being taken, okay, it has been digested and then it has been absorbed. Okay, so now when the food is absorbed, it is distributed and stored in form of proteins, carbohydrates and fats. Yeah, when everything is stored, okay, you need that food for utilization, and for utilization the process of respiration takes in oxygen to break down the food so that what you get is energy. So for energy, what we need, a food which is stored is broken down into a simple process which releases energy. I've told you before also, it releases in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So when this energy is released, what you need to do, what you need to learn is how is the respiration taking place. For that we have another experiment. Have you all seen breads? The breads or the paos what we get from the market. If you try to recreate the same thing, of course not watching on YouTube, but if you try to recreate the same thing, your dough, the maida dough or the atta dough won't be that fluffy. It won't be that generous. So what you need to do, or what usually people do, is they add the baker's yeast. So there is a similar experiment which, or maybe activity which has been shown to you all, wherein what you are going to do is you are going to take a fruit solution, a fruit juice or maybe a sugar solution, okay, you are going to add yeast, activated yeast. Please of course don't do that, but then it is available in the market. Now supposingly this is the solution with the yeast. Where shall I draw? Fine, here. Okay, this is the sugar solution along with yeast. Fine. And after this, what you do is, this is open, so you apply a cork. Now what is a cork? Simple way to explain, what you have, the wooden thing which you know that you see in Chinese or Japanese movie, or maybe on the wine bottle. The wooden thing is known as the cork. But this has a trick. A cork has a hole in the center through which you pass a tube, such that one end of the tube is present in the beaker containing this solution, while the other end of the tube is immersed into a test tube. And again in this test tube what you need to take is star. In this test tube what you need to take is the lime water. We all know when the carbon dioxide is released, the lime water turns milky. We heard that in the activity 1 as well. So what you need to do is you take a lime water, and after a few moments what you see is the lime water will turn milky. Now what is sugar? Sugar is nothing but glucose. When the glucose, or when the sugar, when the yeast acts upon the glucose and sugar, it releases carbon dioxide. Why? Because it breaks down sugar into carbon dioxide and generates ATP, which is the form of energy. So after this, what you realize is, similar in our body we have carbohydrates, we have fats, we have proteins stored inside our body. So first source of energy are the carbohydrates, and the simplest carbohydrates is glucose, and whenever there is glucose present, it needs to be break down. Why it needs to be break down? To produce certain amount of energy. Now how this is done, we are going to learn in this chapter. But first, you all might have a little idea of how, okay, you might have a little idea of process known as aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Now if I talk about aerobic respiration, it is done with the presence of air or maybe oxygen. When I talk about anaerobic respiration, air and oxygen is absent. So this yeast generally converts sugar into carbon dioxide and release energy in the form of anaerobic respiration. Now in respiration there are three pathways. Okay, if I talk about the three pathways, the very first thing you all need to understand that this glucose gets converted into pyruvate, or maybe gets broken down into pyruvate. Fine, it happens in cytoplasm. Where is cytoplasm? The plasma membrane of the cell, that is inside the cell. And glucose is 6 carbon compound, pyruvate is 3 carbon compound. Now after this pyruvate is formed, there are again 3 processes through which the pyruvate is being broken down. Of course, the first one what we learned about yeast is the anaerobic processes. Now what you get in that is ethanol plus carbon dioxide in what? Anaerobic process. Now the second one has to be aerobic process. In aerobic process, what you get is carbon dioxide plus water, sorry the board might not be clear, plus energy. Now what energy? The energy in form of ATP. Okay, and there is third process which you all might be aware of, which happens in our muscles during certain time, that is the lactic acid formation. Okay, when there is not enough amount of oxygen present in our body, or maybe we are doing some vigorous exercise, okay, when we are doing some kind of vigorous exercise, what happens is suddenly we tend to get cramps. Why do we get cramps? In our legs, or maybe in our hands, or maybe the lower foot is twisted. Why happens so? Why? It is because of this process. When the pyruvate does not get enough amount of oxygen, okay, it has oxygen but no enough amount, like 38 molecules and 2 molecules, there are various numbers which you will learn further, but not enough amount of oxygen. This pyruvate is broken down into lactic acid, and when there is accumulation of lactic acid. Now what is accumulation? Accumulation is storing. एक जगह पे कपड़ा डालने का, उधर ऊपर पूरा, that is accumulation. Fine. So when there is accumulation of lactic acid, your muscle tends to spasm, and that is known as your cramps. So there are 3 kinds of respiration which takes place. Now if I talk about respiration in plants, how does it take place? I have very well told you all during photosynthesis. Respiration takes place via diffusion in plants. In plants, what happens? Everything which is there present gets diffused, okay, and therefore what happens is the process of respiration is completed. That is, carbon dioxide, wherever it is processed, it is diffused into the outer atmosphere, which generally happens during night. Why? Because during day the same carbon dioxide is used up and made into oxygen for the process of photosynthesis. Very good. So when we talk about animals have various types of respiration. Now if I talk about the water animal, okay, there are again some activities wherein you just have to just observe a fish. before that, let's come on to something known as ATP. I have already explained you all that ATP is in three forms: adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate, and adenosine monophosphate in the last lecture. ATP, ADP and AMP. So whenever mono means 1, di means 2 and tri means 3, whenever there is one phosphate, okay, and another phosphate adds up, it becomes ADP. Okay, whenever there are two phosphates and another phosphate adds up, it becomes ATP. Now this addition of phosphate requires tremendous amount of energy, and that is endothermic energy. Endothermic energy is something wherein the heat is absorbed and not generated. Okay, so this kind of energy process happens in ATP. And what is ATP like? If you talk about a simple battery cell, okay, if you put that battery cell into a toy, it will run, it will crawl or whatever. If you put that simple battery cell into a clock, it will move. If you put a simple battery cell into a fan, maybe what it will do, it will rotate and produce wind. If you put a same battery cell in some torch light, it will give light. So what is happening is the battery cell remains the same, but the battery cell in the toy is producing mechanical energy. The battery cell in the light is producing light energy. The battery cell in the clock is producing again mechanical energy, or in the toy it might produce sound energy, clapping sound, etc. And the same battery cell might produce other types of energy. So similarly, the ATP has similar function to that of battery cell. It might produce whatever type of energy you need. You might need some energy for respiration, you might need some energy for digestion, you might need some energy for walking, you might need more energy for running. So all these forms of energy are produced by ATP. Fine. So if we move ahead, we were talking about respiration in animals. Now the respiration of plants has been pretty well covered along with the photosynthesis. Now if I talk about respiration in animals, what are the forms of respiration in animals? You all have been known that the respiration in animals, the gills of the fish, or maybe the tadpoles has the gills in the initial stage and rather than respirates through skin, various such facts. So if I talk about water animal, there is a slight activity, kind of a observational activity of course, which is given to you all. That is, you need to see a fish in a fish tank. Of course you won't go to the sea, but then if you see a fish in a fish tank, you see that it inhales or it takes in water in through the mouth, and then via the gills which are present sideways near the ears, it pulls or pushes it forcefully. So what happens in that process? The gills takes in oxygen from the water that is present, and you all know in air the oxygen is present in form of atoms, but in water it is present in a diffuse state. So it is very difficult for us to breathe in water than in air. In water we can't breathe, but in air we can breathe nicely. So this happens, and if you see the respiration rate of the gills or maybe the fish is much higher than the humans, and you all might be knowing that what we take is somewhere 16 to 18 breaths per hour depending upon the work intensity, which reduces when we are asleep and which increases when we are doing vigorous activities. But respiration rate in fish which has gills is far more. Okay, so this concludes some of the respiration in the aquatic animals. Now let us move on to the terrestrial animals. Okay, now again, how I explained you all about the villi, the finger-like projection in the small intestine, which has large surface area. Why did it has large surface area? because to increase the rate of adsorption. Similarly, the lungs or maybe the respiratory organ has large surface area to increase the rate of absorption. Okay, now when the rate of absorption is increased, the amount of oxygen which is being taken inside increases, and when the amount of oxygen which is taken inside increases, of course the respiration increases. So if I talk about this respiratory organ, surely it won't be lying on the outer surface, because it is a delicate membrane and it can break. So usually it is lying inside the body, but it is connected via a passage. Now here what we call is the nasal passage and the trachea. Now, similar to digestion, if we start with the respiration, the very first thing is the nasal passage. Now, in nasal passage, what is present? In the nasal passage, there is presence of hair along with mucus. Along with hair, along with mucus. Now what happens is, when you breathe in air, of course during COVID-19, what you all do is probably wear a mask and then go outside, and since the vehicles are also not in that great amount, the pollution is low, but usually in Mumbai the pollution is way too high. So when you breathe in air, of course you can't expect to breathe in the fresh amount of air. So what happens is, you breathe in air which contains all kind of dust, all kind of mud, and especially when you go in Nare Park, what you get is all winds with mud inside it and dust particles. So what happens is, these particles cannot enter your lungs. Why? It's simple, because accumulation of this particle leads to lung damage. So what happens is, the nasal passage along with the hair and mucous membrane just separates that. Okay, and when there are too many of this particle, what you get? A nice mucous membrane in your nose, maybe blocked. Fine. So this is how, it's funny, but then this is how the mucus and the hair works. They help in accumulation of these particles and then releasing kind of fresher air into the nasal cavity, and the nasal cavity is the passage right behind. I request you all to open your books to page number 104, so that you get a clear understanding of how is the respiratory system working. Okay, so if I talk about the nasal passage is quite big, okay, and it contains all the air what we take in during respiration through our nose. Okay, if I talk about nose, nostrils, then what happens is, this nasal passage leads to a pipe-like thing which is known as trachea. Now this trachea branches into smaller tracheids and bronchi. Now this bronchi, you all can just refer to the diagram, which will be easier and convenient for you to understand. But this bronchi has at the end a lobular sac-like structure which are known as the alveolus. Now if I talk about alveolus, these are small sac-like structure, but this structure have blood vessels lined throughout its membrane. Why blood vessels? So that the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place simultaneously and efficiently. Fine. So what we do is, we inhale the air. Let's understand the mechanism. We understood the outline. Let's understand the mechanism. We also know that the lungs are covered in the rib cage. Now if I talk about mechanism, we breathe in air. The moment we breathe in air, we have a diaphragm which is as shown in the picture below your lungs, and it is slightly curved or bent. This diaphragm tends to flatten. The moment this diaphragm flattens, our chest tends to become full, and that is how we can inhale a large quantity of air, and that you all know while doing the yoga asanas. Fine. After the inhaling of air, what happens is the air passes through this wherein it is getting purified, then it goes through the trachea, from the trachea to the tracheids to the bronchi, and then from the bronchi to the alveolus. Now this air comes into the alveolus and gets in contact with the blood vessels surrounding it. Now the oxygen in the bronchi of the fresh air that we have breathed in goes into the blood vessels, and the carbon dioxide from the blood vessels goes into the bronchi again, and that air we expel out. That is exhalation. Now, one thing to remember, the lungs themselves have some quantity of air inside them, so that there is, higher chances of inhalation and exhalation going smooth. Okay, so here we understand how the mechanism of diffusion of oxygen takes place. After diffusion of oxygen, the filtered air, of course, and the oxygen is being diffused, what happens is that this oxygen via the blood vessels is carried to the heart, and throughout the body. Now this carrying of the blood has a certain pigment. Remember the pigment in the photosynthesis, which was chlorophyll? Similarly, this pigment is known as hemoglobin. Now you all know why the blood is red, because it is having a pigment, because it is having a pigment known as hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin pigment is, has affinity to oxygen. The moment you see oxygen, it will grab it. Like how small children have affinity to chocolate, similarly, the moment the hemoglobin see oxygen, it will grab. And hemoglobin, when comes in contact with all the alveolus, which is like wide, very wide, it's like 80 meter square, it's this wide. Now if I talk about simple, mathematics, if I, just take this into consideration, it's more, okay, so it's nearly 20. So that is, how wide the alveolus is when it is spread throughout. Let's not concentrate on that. When the air is being, the oxygen is being passed, the hemoglobin having higher affinity for oxygen, of course it is present in the blood, it will take in the oxygen and go to the site where the site needs the oxygen, and this oxygen is then given out, and then the carbon dioxide is taken. But one twist over here, the oxygen is taken by hemoglobin, but the carbon dioxide is not taken by hemoglobin. Rather, it remains soluble in the blood, because blood has hemoglobin and water in it. Okay, so the oxygen is taken by hemoglobin, but the carbon dioxide is not taken by hemoglobin. Rather, it is soluble in blood, and then again the deoxygenated blood, that is lack of oxygen and carbon dioxide, comes in contact with the alveolus, and again the oxygenation takes place, and this is how our respiration is completed. Now in the end, I would like you all to understand few facts about respiration. See, simple diffusion. If we carry out a whole respiration process by simple diffusion, that is exchange of gases, it will take at least 3 years to reach, the oxygen to the feet, or maybe the nails, or maybe the toes, and therefore to reduce or to minimize this process, we have a very fantastic pigment known as the hemoglobin. What it does is, the diffusion might take 3 years, in which we couldn't survive. Of course, if you don't have oxygen for 3 years in your body, you won't survive. Okay, so hemoglobin reaches like within a span of quite seconds to minutes maybe, and provide oxygen throughout the body. So we are blessed to have this pigment, of course. And the other thing is alveolus. It is great. It has great size, which I told you all, 80 meters square if you spread it all over. And this everything takes part in respiration. Now, one note I would like to add before ending our topic for today. So, what happens when you smoke? Okay, now there is a passage, and do you know, like, wherein they have told, like, lung cancer is predominantly happening when the person smokes. Why is it so? Because smoking has large quantity of particles which gets settled right from our nostrils to our trachea to maybe the lungs, and it gets accumulated there. Okay, you all might have seen the ads before the moving, like they're squishing the lungs, and all kind of blackish water comes out from it. So similar to that. Okay, and when this accumulation goes on and on and on, the cells might divide in uneven rapid way, which might lead to lung cancer. So be precautious, avoid anything which has this substances like nicotine and etc., and that is why it has been given in your book. So here we end up with a topic for today, that is respiration.